Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. We are continuing the chapter The Fairacre Ghost, and Miss Reed is hearing the story about how her colleague, Mr. Annett, saw the ghost one night before choir practice. The vicar was alone in the vestry when Mr. Annett arrived at St. Patrick's. Good evening, said the vicar boisterously, and then caught sight of his choir master's face. My dear boy, you look as though you'd seen a ghost, he said. You speak more truly than you realize, Mr. Annett answered soberly. He began to walk through to the chancel and his organ, but the vicar barred his way. His kind old face was puckered with concern. Was it poor Job? He asked gently. I don't know who it was, replied the schoolmaster. He explained briefly what had happened. He was more shaken by this encounter than he cared to admit. Somehow the affinity between the stranger and himself had seemed so strong. It made the man's dreadful disclosure and then his withdrawal even more shocking. The vicar put both hands on the young man's shoulders. Poor Job, he said, is nothing to be frightened of. It is a sad tale, and it happened long ago. After choir practice, I hope you will come back to the vicarage for tea, and I will do my best to tell you Job's story. The younger man managed a wan smile. Thank you, vicar, he said. I should be glad to hear more of him. I had a strange feeling while we were together. He faltered to a stop. What kind of feeling? Asked the vicar gently. Mr. Annett moved restlessly. His brow was furrowed with perplexity. As though, it sounds absurd, but as though we were brothers. It was as if we were akin, as if we shared something. The vicar nodded slowly and sighed, dropping his hands from the young man's shoulders. You shared sorrow, my son, he said as he turned away. But his tone was so low that the words were lost in a burst of country voices from the chancel. Together the two men made their way from the vestry to the duties before them. The vicarage drawing-room was empty when the vicar and his guest entered an hour or so later. A bright fire blazed on the hearth, and Mr. Annett gratefully pulled up an armchair. He felt as though he would never be warm again. He sipped the tea which the vicar gave him and was glad of its comfort. He was deathly tired and recognized this as a symptom of shock. Part of his mind longed for sleep, but part craved to hear the story which the vicar had promised. Before long, the older man put aside his cup, lodged 3 stout logs upon the fire, and settled back in his chair to recount his tale. Job Carpenter, said the vicar, was a shepherd. He was born in Victoria's reign in the year of the Great Exhibition of 1851, and was the 10th child in a long family. His parents lived in a small cottage at Beech Green end of Fairacre, and all their children were born there. They were desperately poor, for Job's father was a farm laborer, and times were hard. At 10 years old, Job was out at work on the downs, stone-picking, bird-scaring, and helping his father to clear ditches and lay hedges. But by the time he was 15, he had decided that it was sheep he wanted to tend. The shepherd at that time was a surly old fellow, twisted with rheumatism and foul of tongue. Job served a cruel apprenticeship under him, and in the last year or two of the old man's life virtually looked after the flock himself. This fact did not go unnoticed by the farmer. One morning during lambing time, Job entered the little hut carrying twin lambs which were weakly. There, stretched upon the sacks stuffed with straw which made the old man's bed, lay his master, open-eyed and cold. Within 2 days, Job had been told he was now shepherd, and he continued in this post for the rest of his life. He grew into a handsome fellow, tall and broad, with a blond, wiry hair and curling beard. The girls of Fairacre and Beech Green found him attractive and made the fact quite plain, but Job was shy and did not respond as readily as his fellows. One day, however, he met a girl whom he had never seen before. Her family lived in Beech Green, but she was in service in London. Job's sister worked with her, and the two girls were given a week's holiday at the same time. She walked over to see Job's sister one warm spring evening, and the two girls wandered across the downs to see the lambs at play. Job watched them approach. His sister Jane was tall and fair, as he was. Her companion was a complete contrast. She was little more than 5 feet in height, with long silky black hair coiled in a thick plait round her head like a coronet. She had a small heart-shaped face, slow dark eyes which slanted upwards at the corners, and narrow crescents of eyebrows. Joe thought her the prettiest thing he had ever seen. Her name was Mary. To Job, who had a deep religious faith, this seemed wholly fitting. She was a queen among women. Job had no doubt this time and no shyness. Before Mary's week of holiday had ended, the two young people came to an understanding. It was Christmas time before they saw each other again, and only a few letters, written for them by better-schooled friends, passed between Mary and Job during the long months of separation. They planned to get married in the autumn of the following year. Mary would return to London and save every penny possible from her pitiful earnings, and Job would ask for a cottage of his own at Michaelmas. He was fortunate. The farmer offered him a little thatched house not far from the church at Fairacre. It had 2 rooms up and 2 down, and a sizable triangle of garden where a man could grow plenty of vegetables, keep a pig and a few hens, and so go more than halfway towards being self-supporting. A few fruit trees shaded the garden, and a lusty young crab-apple tree grew in the hedge nearby. The couple married at Michaelmas and were as happy as larks in their new home. Mary took work at the vicarage and found it less arduous than the living-in job in London. She was a quick, quiet worker in the house, and the vicar's wife approved of her. She was delighted to discover that her new daily was also an excellent needlewoman, and Mary found herself carrying home bundles of shirts whose collars needed turning, sheets that needed sides to middling, and damask table linen in need of a fine darning. She was particularly glad of this extra money, for by the end of the first year of their married life, a child was due, and Mary knew she would have to give up the scrubbing and heavy lifting for a few weeks at least. The coming of the child was of intense joy to Job. He adored his wife and made no secret of it. The fact that he cleaned her shoes and took her tea in the morning was known in Fairacre and looked upon as a crying scandal, particularly by the men. What was a woman for but to wait upon her menfolk? Job Carpenter was proper daft to pander to a wife in that namby-pamby way. Only laying up a store of trouble for himself in the future, said the village wiseacres in The Beetle and Wedge. Job, more in love than ever, let such gossip flow by him. The baby took its time in coming, and as soon as Job saw it, he realized it could not possibly survive. His experience with hundreds of lambs gave him a pretty shrewd idea of a good doer or a weakling. Mary, cradling it in her arms, smiling with happiness, suspected nothing. It was all the more tragic for her when, on the 3rd day, her little son quietly expired. She lay in a raging fever for a fortnight, and it was months before she was herself again. Throughout this time, Job nursed her with loving constancy, comforting her when she wept, encouraging any spark of recovery. In the 2 years that followed, 2 miscarriages occurred, and the young couple began to wonder if they would ever have a family. The cottage gave them great joy, and the garden was one of the prettiest in the village, but it was a child that they really wanted. Everyone liked the Carpenters, and Job's demonstrative affection for his wife was looked upon with more indulgence by the villagers as time passed. At last Mary found that she was pregnant yet again. The vicar's wife, for whom she still worked, was determined that this baby should arrive safely, and insisted on Mary being examined regularly by her own doctor. She engaged, too, a reputable midwife from Caxley to attend the birth, for the local midwife at that time in Fairacre and Beech Green was a slatternly creature, reeking of gin and unwashed garments, whose very presence caused revulsion rather than reassurance to her unfortunate patients. All went well. The baby was a lusty boy who throve from the time he entered the world. Job and Mary could hardly believe their good fortune, and peered into his cot 100 times a day to admire his fair beauty. One early October day, when the child was a few months old, Mary was sitting at the table with a pile of mending before her. The boy lay asleep in his cradle beside her. It was a wild, windy day. The autumn equinox had stirred the weather to tempestuous conditions, and the trees in the little garden flailed their branches in the uproar. Leaves whirled by the cottage window, and every now and again a spatter of hail hit the glass like scattered shot. The doors rattled, the thin curtains stirred in the draught, and the whole cottage shuddered in the force of the gale. Mary was nervous and wondered how poor Job was faring outside in the full force of the unkind elements. As the afternoon wore on, the gale increased. Mary had never known such violence. There was a roaring noise in the chimney which was terrifying, and a banshee howling of wind round the house which woke the baby and made him cry. Mary lifted him from his cradle to comfort him, and walked back and forth with him against her shoulder. There was a sudden increase in the noise outside, a curious drumming sound in the heart of the fury. To Mary's horror, she saw through the window the small chicken house at the end of the garden swept upward and carried, twisting bizarrely, into the field beyond. At the same time, a great mass of straw, clearly torn from a nearby rick, went whirling along the garden, and as it passed, one of the apple trees, laden with golden fruit, snapped off at the base as though it were a flower stem. Mary could scarcely believe her eyes. She stood rooted to the spot between the table and the fireplace, her baby clutched to her. The drumming sound grew louder until it was unendurable. Mary was about to scream with panic when a terrifying rumbling came near at hand. The chimney stack crashed upon the cottage roof, cracking the rafters like matchwood and sending ceilings, furniture, bricks, and rubble cascading upon the two terror-stricken occupants of the little home. When Job arrived at the scene of the disaster, soaked to the skin and wild with anxiety, he found the whole of one end of his house had collapsed. No one was there, for the neighbors were all coping with troubles of their own, and there had been no time to see how others were faring in the catastrophe that had befallen Fairacre in a matter of minutes. He began tearing at the beams and sagging thatch with his bare hands, shouting hoarsely to his wife and son as he struggled. There was no answer to his cries. A ghastly silence seemed to pervade the ruined house, in contrast to the fiendish noises which raged about it. An hour later, when neighbors arrived to help, they found him there, still screaming and struggling to reach his dead. Sweat and tears poured down his ravaged face, his clothes were torn, his battered hands bleeding. When, finally, the broken bodies of his wife and child were recovered, Job had to be led away, and only the doctor's drugs brought him merciful oblivion at the end of that terrible day. In the weeks that followed, while his house was being repaired, Job was offered hospitality throughout Fairacre, but he would have none of it. As soon as the pitiful funeral was over, he returned numbly to his work, coming back each night to his broken home and sleeping on a makeshift bed in the one remaining room. Neighbors did their best for him, cooking him a meal, washing his linen, comforting him with friendly words and advice. He seemed scarcely to see or hear them, and heads shook over Job's sad plight. "There's naught can help him but time," said one. "'Tis best to let him get his grief alone," said another. "Once he gets his house set to rights, he'll start to pick up," said a third. Fairacre watched poor Job anxiously. The men who had been sent to repair the cottage worked well and quickly. Their sympathy was stirred by the sight of the gaunt young man's lonely existence in the undamaged half of his tiny house. At length the living room was done. The bricks which had crashed on that fateful afternoon had been built again into the chimney breast. The broken rafters had been replaced, the walls plastered and whitewashed afresh. Job met the men as he trudged home from work. They called to him with rough sympathy. "It's ready for you now," they shouted through the twilight. "We've finished at last." A kindly neighbor had gone in to replace his furniture. There now, she said in a motherly burr, you can settle in here tonight. But Job shook his head and turned into his old room. Sad at heart, the good old soul returned home, but could not forget the sight of Job's ravaged face. I'll go and take a look at him, she said to her husband later that evening. If the lamp's alight in the room, then I'll know he's settled in, and I'll go more comfortable to bed. But the window was dark. She was about to turn homeward again when she heard movements inside the cottage and saw the living room door open. Job stood upon the threshold, a candle in his hand. Breathless in the darkness of the garden, the watcher saw him make his way slowly across the room to the chimney breast. He put down the guttering candle and rested his fair head against the brickwork. Before long, his great shoulders began to heave, and the sound of dreadful sobbing sent the onlooker stealthily homeward. "'Tis best by far to leave him be," comforted the neighbor's husband when she told him what she had witnessed. "We'll go and see him in the morning. It will all be over by then." But there was little comfort for the woman that night, for the spectacle of Job's grief drove all hope of sleep away. Next morning they went together to the house. Her heart was heavy with foreboding as they walked up the little brick path. Inside the silent house they found him, with a noose around his neck, hanging against the chimney breast, which had crushed his wife, his child, and every hope of Job himself. There was an uncanny silence in the sunny lane as Mr. Annett finished speaking. "And that," he said soberly, "is the tale of poor Job as the vicar told it to me." Suddenly a blackbird called from a hazel bush, breaking the spell. Despite the sunshine, I shivered. We were alone, for Malcolm and his mother had gone ahead to pick primroses from the steep banks, and though we were surrounded by the sights and scents of spring, I remained chilled by this strange winter's tale. "You're sure it was a ghost?" I asked shakily. "Other people have seen Job," answered Mr. Annett, "and the vicar knew all about him, but I believe I am the only person that Job has spoken to." "I wonder why," I mused aloud. "Perhaps he felt we had much in common," said Mr. Annett quietly. I remembered suddenly Mr. Annett's own tragedy. He, too, had adored a young wife and had lost her in the face of overwhelming violence. He, too, had watched a broken body removed to an early grave. There was no misery, no depth of hopelessness which Job had known, which was not known, too, to young Mr. Annett. We were summoned abruptly from the shadowy past by the sound of young Malcolm's excited voice. "There's a nest here," he called, "with eggs. Come and look." "Coming," shouted Mr. Annett, suddenly looking 10 years younger, and he ran off, all grief forgotten, to join his wife and child. And we'll hear more tales of Fairacre next time.